Imagine being given a name, a face, a location, and a few critical details once. No notebook, no flashcards, no highlighting. Hours later, you're expected to remember them accurately. Now, compare that with this. You spend 3 hours studying for an exam. You reread the same chapter. You highlight half the page. You watch a lecture at 1.5x speed, and the next morning, you look at your notes and think, wait, I studied this. You recognize the words, but you can't explain them. So what happened? Did you suddenly get a worse memory? No, your brain was doing exactly what it evolved to do. It was deciding what was worth keeping, and that decision happens long before you ever forget. Think about the last thing you genuinely couldn't afford to forget. Maybe it was a phone number you desperately needed, a password you use every day, the directions to a place you've never been, or the exact moment someone said something that changed how you saw them. You probably didn't sit down and study it. You didn't make a study schedule. You didn't quiz yourself every 20 minutes. You just remembered. Why? Because the information had consequences, and your brain is extremely sensitive to consequences. This is one of the biggest differences between ordinary studying and high-stakes learning. When information is connected to a real situation, your attention changes. You're not just hearing words. You're building a mental map. Who is this person? What does this detail mean? What happens if I get it wrong? What should I notice next? That's a completely different mental state from staring at page 247 of a textbook because your exam is Friday. And here's the uncomfortable part. Your brain doesn't care how badly you want an A. It cares about what you pay attention to. You can sit at a desk for 5 hours while your mind wanders every 30 seconds. Or you can spend 40 minutes actively trying to solve a problem, explain an idea, and retrieve information from memory. Those 2 sessions may look completely different on paper, but your brain experiences them very differently. Here's a simple experiment. Read this sentence. The capital of Australia is Canberra. Easy. Now close your eyes. Don't look back. What was the capital? You probably know it. But now imagine I ask you the same question tomorrow. Maybe you hesitate. Maybe you remember the word. Maybe you don't. Now imagine I give you a map of Australia and ask, you have 1 minute to identify the capital before your flight leaves. Suddenly, the information feels different. Why? Because you've given your brain a job, and brains remember useful things better than useless ones. This is where students often make a massive mistake. They confuse exposure with learning. You read something. It looks familiar. You think, I know this. But familiarity is cheap. Recognition is not mastery. The real test is brutally simple. Can you produce the answer when the answer isn't sitting in front of you? Close the book. Put the notes away. Explain the concept out loud. Write down everything you remember. Try to solve the problem without looking at the solution. And suddenly, you discover what you actually know. That uncomfortable moment, that's not failure. That's training. Because every time you force your brain to retrieve information, you're practicing the exact skill you will eventually need, remembering. And there's a strange paradox here. The easiest way to study can sometimes be one of the least effective. Rereading feels smooth. Everything is right there. You get that satisfying feeling of, yeah, I understand this. But your brain isn't being challenged to find anything. Now compare that with a blank page. No notes, no textbook, just you and one question. What do I remember? Silence. A few seconds of frustration. Then, wait, I think it was that struggle is valuable. Not because suffering magically makes you smarter, but because retrieval requires your brain to reconstruct the information instead of simply recognizing it. And this is why spacing matters too. Study something today. Test yourself tomorrow. Come back to it 3 days later, then a week later. Each time, you're asking your brain to recover something that is beginning to fade. And that fading is important because memory isn't a photograph. It's more like a path through a forest. Every time you walk it, the path becomes easier to find. But if you never walk it again, the forest slowly grows back. Now, here's where the CIA comparison becomes especially interesting. Real intelligence work isn't some magical world where agents possess photographic memories. They forget things too. They're human. The difference is that intelligence training emphasizes skills like observation, recall, analysis, and applying information under realistic conditions. The information isn't always learned as isolated trivia. It's connected to a situation, a person, a mission, a decision, a consequence. And that changes the question from, what am I supposed to memorize, to what do I need to notice, and what could this information mean? That's a completely different way of learning. And you can steal the principle without being a spy. Take something you're studying studying right now. Don't just memorize the definition. Ask, why does this exist? What problem does it solve? What would happen if it didn't exist? Can I connect it to a 12-year-old? Can I connect it to something I already understand? Can I use it to solve a problem I've never seen before? Now you're not collecting facts. You're building a network, and networks are much harder to forget than isolated pieces of information. There's another reason this matters. Emotion. Think about your first day at a new school, your first serious argument with someone, the moment you got unexpectedly good news, the day you made a decision you still think about. Years later, tiny details may still be there. The room, the weather, the expression on someone's face, the exact feeling in your stomach. You didn't study those memories. Your brain decided they mattered. That's the lesson. If you want something to stick, don't just increase the amount of time you spend looking at it. Increase the amount of meaning, retrieval, and application attached to it. And suddenly, studying becomes less about endurance and more about engineering your own memory. So the next time you forget something you studied for hours, don't immediately conclude, I have a terrible memory. Ask something more useful. Did I ever actually practice remembering it? Because your brain isn't a hard drive. It doesn't store everything you feed it. It filters, it predicts, it prioritizes. And every day, it's quietly asking, will I need this again? So give it a reason to say yes. Don't just read the answer. Try to retrieve it. Don't just memorize the fact. Connect it to something. Don't just study for the test. Use the knowledge before the test forces you to. Because the people who remember the most aren't necessarily the people with the biggest brains. They're often the people who learned one simple lesson. Memory isn't just about what enters your mind. It's about what your mind is repeatedly forced to find. And maybe that's why the real difference between forgetting and remembering isn't intelligence at all. It's whether your brain ever had a reason to care.